Michael. I graduated from UCC in 2020 and was a part of Howard's House. So I'm currently on a gap year right now, and I will be attending Harvard this fall. I'm not exactly sure what I'll be studying yet, since I have until my second year to declare my concentration. So how it works is the classes in your first year are pretty general and are often courses that everyone will take regardless of their major. But my gap year experience has been great. I've really enjoyed this freedom to pursue what interests me. So I'm able to kind of create my own schedule and also change pace whenever I feel like. So there's a lot of flexibility involved in my gap year. But currently, I've been doing some research on self-driving cars. And more specifically, I'm looking at sort of the decision-making process. So we have an intersection setup with different cars traveling in different directions. And we kind of want to see how they interact depending on kind of how well we train the Q cars as well. So we can see how the amount of training they've had impacts their performance.
I see, I see. Um, Mario, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so since you're working with autonomous cars and everything, uh, what got you interested in them? Like, what is the thing that?
Well, I've always been fascinated with cars, driving, and just tech in general. And I think it's really remarkable just how far we've come in this field really recently. Like we've already seen cars with a good level of autonomous driving capability like Tesla's, but there's also so much more incredible research that's happening right now. And so I think it's quite interesting just to see how we can kind of use machine learning and artificial intelligence to drive cars and see how they interact.
Yeah. So what is the path that a UCC student should take? Like what subjects and everything to start working with autonomous vehicles?
Mhm. Well, I don't think there's really one specific path you need to take. Like many career paths, there are multiple ways you can reach the same endpoint. And I think this is particularly the case at the high school level. Like a lot of the courses are still quite general, so you don't really dig deep too much into the like knowledge that you need to really work with autonomous cars. But I think the most important skill at this point really is your programming knowledge and your experience with computer science and just general knowledge of algorithms as well. And I know there are CS courses at UCC you can take, but you can also look at online courses as well through sites like edX and Coursera, where you can learn specific programming languages and even specific applications. There are classes where they can teach you to work with like self-driving cars on your own as well, and like download programs to help train it as well. So there's a lot of things you can start working on in your free time as well.
Yeah, thank you. Patrick, you want to?
Yeah, so you talked a good amount about like your gap year and how you can do your own schedule, and it's nice to be on your own pace, which I assume is pretty nice. But what would you see as like possible risks or like problems with taking a gap year for future?
Yeah. So I don't think there are any significant risks per se. As long as your spot in the next year's class is guaranteed, there isn't really a risk of taking gap year. I know some schools, especially during COVID, tried to restrict students from taking gap years just because there were too many deferring. But in my case, there wasn't really a risk. My spot is guaranteed for next year, and I'm just entering like every other student that will be joining in this class, the class of 2025. But I will say that one thing that I was a bit worried about when I decided to take a gap year was just that, I don't know, there's this like fear that you might be wasting your time if you don't have anything to do. Now, I think this is also caused by the mindset that we need to be 100% productive at all times, which really is not the case. So I think for me, I think you need to first realize that it's okay to not be completely filled to the brim like a lot of people in high school are, and to realize that like downtime and free time is acceptable, and it's okay to like just take it easy. But for me, I think a gap year really in factoring my decision was just an opportunity to experience all 4 years of university and also to start university with a clear idea as to what I wanted to do. So like a gap year is a great opportunity to reflect and also to really think about, like what kinds of clubs you might want to get involved in, what courses to take. And being in this gap year position, it's cool too, because I know people from 2 classes now. I know people who are currently at Harvard and are taking classes and are, on campus, and I can always ask them for their opinion on certain classes or clubs and like kind of the ins and outs of campus life itself. So it's helpful there to have that network for sure.
That's great to hear. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, Michael, so since we are on the topic of a gap year, maybe would you like to walk us over a typical day of yours during the gap year so we can get a sense of how gap year, students, truly work?
Yeah, I'd say there's really no typical day, to be honest. For me, each day is a bit of a surprise, but most of the time I'm on my computer at home. So I'm working remotely on self-driving cars. So I'm connecting to remote workstations located at the lab. And from just using remote desktop, I can control both our simulation and our physical car this way. Sometimes I'll be in Zoom meetings with my research mentor to discuss our next steps and to fix bugs in our code together. So we're still able to collaborate and discuss as if we were working in person. So in that regard, it's been still pretty productive. But outside of work, and I think this is also good to know, like if you want to take a gap year, is that there's more time to relax too. For me, that includes like listening to music and playing it as well, watching TV, and also more recently, enjoying the nice weather we've been having. We're finally in that zone where we're able to actually enjoy the outdoors a bit more.
Yeah, sounds good. And were you involved in any sort of internship during this gap year time, by all means?
I was part of like a startup before that was created like a program also using artificial intelligence to prioritize like and target advertisements. So they were an ad tech company. Now I was not involved in the CS background of that, but I was more on the marketing side. So my goal was to try to describe what the company did in like a clear way for potential clients to understand. Because obviously like a lot of the artificial intelligence algorithms are quite complex, and you just want to make it, you want to convey it in a way that it makes it clear what our competitive advantage is and also describes like the nuances of the technology without being overly technical at the same time. So it's been nice as well, looking at the other side of like kind of AI as well, looking at how everything is being implemented in the real world.
Yeah, so Michael, you talked a lot about artificial intelligence being like kind of an emerging technology. So other than the development of like, let's say, self-driving cars in particular, what do you see as other like important emerging like career paths, technologies that high school students like us should be kind of on the watch out for?
Yeah. if I could pinpoint this to a T, I'd be a trillionaire. But overall, I'd say that sustainable technology and, for example, like finding alternative sources of energy and new ways to repurpose waste is going to be a leading industry going forward. We're clearly at a point where we need to act immediately to both stop and reverse the changes of climate change. So I think it's important for us, and it's going to be huge, to innovate and find ways to eliminate the so-called green premium, which is like the difference between the cost you need to use green energy versus conventional sources of energy, because we want to make it practical to adopt green technology on a global scale and make it the right choice to do from a financial and ecological perspective. So I think that is a huge industry and something that's very necessary and relevant, especially now. And I think it's something that is quite exciting too, because there's so many possibilities, like, I don't know, using plant fuels to power cars and planes and things like that. There are a lot of different possibilities, and I think we're only just getting started on this too.
Right. And also, like, if I may just like kind of ask a follow-up questions regarding what you did with the autonomous cars, could you like go in greater details, like after months of like conducting like experiments and modeling, like what kind of like interesting findings would you like to share with us regarding autonomous cars and in particular their decision making abilities?
Mhm. So for self-driving cars, we're using a neural network, which basically, which is our way of training it. But what happens is it forms a neural network in training, and then afterwards, when you feed it in like the situation it's involved in during testing, it tries to output like whichever one is the better choice. So it is still kind of working on like a numerical way, which is, I guess, a bit surprising, and it makes sense at the same time too. Like everything is based on numerical parameters that we're giving it. So the car itself doesn't know what is right or wrong. It's up to like engineers and whoever's programming it to decide like how you want to quantify what's right or wrong. So in this case, if you wanted to like, if it's like a collision or something, you want to subtract points away from the total system. And I don't know, if you make it to the other side quicker, you want to gain points, things like that. So it's up to us to kind of like fine tune those weights a bit as well. And we're working really much with like a reward system. My mentor likes to call it, it's kind of like training a pet in a way. Like, if your pet does something right, you give it a reward with like a dog biscuit or a treat. And if your dog or pet doesn't do so well, you have to kind of discipline them. That's kind of the same idea we're working with as well. We're kind of really treating these cars as like something that barely understands what is right and wrong, and it's up to us to kind of give it that like reward and punishment factor when training.
Mm-hmm. Then in your opinion, would you see like in the foreseeable future that different companies will program their autonomous cars differently? So like having different ethical frameworks. Would you see that as kind of like a possibility where, let's say, Google thinks that X is right, whereas Tesla thinks Y is right? And what do you think would happen when there's this kind of ethical discrepancies?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. I was actually thinking about that the other day and talking about it with some friends. And I think just from a competitive standpoint, I feel like ultimately companies would try to adopt the same ethical framework. Because we were talking about like, you've probably heard of those experiments where like, do you decide to like hit this person or this person if you need to, like if you're in a collision that's unavoidable, do you choose to crash your own car or just hit someone else? Like that kind of, those kinds of like ethical dilemmas, right? And I think the issue is if cars are inconsistent, I think consumers would try to choose a car that best fits their ethical framework. So I think if someone's ethical framework is not deemed like moral by overall society, then people are just not going to use it. So I feel like naturally what will happen is a lot of these ethical like frameworks and also like the morals standards behind some of the decisions that the self-driving car will make will ultimately converge, I think. And I think this happens a lot with various business practices as well, because you can easily just say like, they're not an ethical company and then they'll just lose business that way too. So I think what will happen is every company will end up adopting the same standard.
So I have a quick question
Mhm.
about neural networks. So you're using the reward system, and how does a car know if something is right or wrong? And also like, how do you test it? Do you just like let a car drive on its own, like on a parking lot, or how does it work?
Yeah. So the first part of your question was about the reward itself, right? That it's up to us to define the exact numbers. So we feed it into the neural network. And in the case of our algorithm, which is the goal is to just optimize the maximum reward at the end of like a scenario, which is called an episode. That a lot of it is up to us to define. So we can play with the weights to say like, we care about this factor a bit more than a different factor. Like, do we prioritize safety first or like how fast it can go? Like we can tune these in different ways and get different behaviors. But onto the second point about testing. So we usually test it first in the simulation just to see what it is like. But once we have that, our training model does work in the physical world. So we feed it into a neural network that's based on physical cars, and it does the exact same thing. Now, the only difference between the two situations, the simulation and the physical, is how it gets some of its inputs. So the inputs for our case are like the car's position, where it wants to go, and its speed, among other factors. And some of it obviously might not be as accurate actually in the physical world, since we're using like cameras and like various sensors to get that information. Whereas on the simulation, it's just a physical number, and that number is going to be always right. So sometimes when we're working in the physical world, you might actually see some differences in the models. Everything else kept the same would be caused by just these like changes in how it gets its position, gets its speed, and some error that we have to account for. But yeah, we can actually just test it immediately, and it works.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that sounds really cool, Michael. So I was wondering, like, given all the benefits of autonomous car, like people can actually do work on a car right now or sleep on it, while driving, so can save the time and commute and making something productive, and also it's more safe. But in your experiment and trials, did you notice any inherent negative aspect of autonomous cars that we should be aware of, or just any downsides or side effects of autonomous cars?
Mm-hmm. I think the number one thing is I'm not sure how well humans can how like artificial intelligence and robots can fully replace humans in like the social aspect, because I think driving is as much as like a very technical one as a social activity. Like cars trying to like lane change and like you letting others in is something that a lot of people would naturally choose to do. But I think in the case of self-driving cars, I'm just not sure how well that works right now, to be honest. And I feel like that is going to be a bit of a challenge in some ways. But if all cars are self-driving, I think we can fix this issue quite easily. You can literally connect a bunch of cars using like a wireless technology and just have them interact with each other wirelessly instead of like blinkers and other like lights that we have normally on cars. But I think you might encounter an issue if you have a bit of both. If you have like human cars and self-driving cars, I think that's where you can encounter some problems.
Right. And so to go back to the topic of breaks, seeing how many students have taken a gap year this year, in which ways do you think the future is going to be affected by that?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. And I think the impact on this year's grade 12s is pretty big, because there's just so much uncertainty with like how university spots and everything are being allocated. And I'm not even sure how exactly everything's going to work out yet. I'm just not too sure about that. But I think in the long term, there will be some significant changes just in like our lifestyles and in tech overall. I think this is in part due to just gap year students, but I think also more broadly just due to a lot of the impacts of the pandemic. Because I want to point out, it's not just first years who chose to take a gap year. Like many students in upper years also chose to take a leave of absence, and that means they're taking some time off in the middle of their university career. Now, I imagine some students will have come up with crazy ideas for the future during their time off, and we'll really see how this pans out during this decade, because a lot of cool business ideas come from like people who dropped out of university and kind of created their own projects. And I think a lot of students, especially in upper years, might have done similar things as well. And it's also true in the past, just in general, that like various crises, not unlike the pandemic, have spurred innovation and creativity. So I think we're going to see changes in that field specifically, just seeing like how, I don't know, maybe the next biggest company is going to emerge out of this in some way. Some of the things that I've talked about, like, I don't know, green tech or self-driving cars, there might have been like some crazy eureka moment that happened just in the time that students on gap years have been just sitting around and brainstorming interesting ideas.
So we know that you excelled in the IB program, and so we were wondering if you had any tips or pointers that you'd like to share with current UCC students.
For sure. So By far, the most critical skill would be time management and organization. As we all know, at a school of this caliber, we're expected to juggle academics and extracurriculars all the time. It's so important to be able to find a balance and to devote enough time to all your commitments. I personally like to see everything laid out in front of me visually. So I'll give you an example. During like exams, I would grab a copy of the exam prep calendar from the CFL and just write down my exam times and pre-plan my review sessions. So I just try to backtrack like 2 or 3 weeks or say, and just like write down what subject I want to cover on any given day and try to stick to that schedule. So I'm already trying to like plan out everything in advance and also consider for me, and at least in my case, that not all subjects require the same amount of time for preparation. So like some subjects that I find a bit more challenging would have more time allocated than other subjects, for example. But also just on a day-to-day basis, I make sure to use Google Calendar so I can see when my meetings are. And this is something you can do as well. You can set up like daily email reminders. In my case, the agenda reminders, so I can see just like a snapshot of my day in one place. And that just makes it really easy for me to stay organized. I think that's the biggest challenge of the IB and just UCC in general, just staying on top of everything because, you know, like if there's just something unexpected can really throw off your entire schedule. And it's just good to try to be as prepared as much as you can be.
Okay, so my question is also related to time management. So since time is finite, what helped you prioritize different activities? So what made you decide to spend like a 1 hour block on studying for a test or maybe a club or something like that?
That's a good question. I still struggle at this a bit myself, to be honest. I'm not always prioritizing my time in exactly the right place. I've been just I'm more usually concerned with just trying to get something done, whatever that is. But I think in the case of prioritization, it sometimes comes down to just really some questions you have to ask yourself, like, what are you interested in more? What are you contributing to more? What means more to you? Things like that would really help identify what it is you want to focus on. I think this is also important for me actually going forward because in university, like you have free time and there are also so much things you can possibly do that you can fill that time with. But I think there's also like an important skill that you need to learn is actually just a bit of self-restraint too, just not over committing yourself and burdening yourself with like various commitments.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I have one question about, because I'm really interested in neural networks.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how should I like approach it and how should I start learning about it. So do you have any advice for me? Like how should I?
Yeah. My mentor sent me like various articles to read, most of it on Medium, where you have a bunch of like just people writing their own articles and explaining like some of their own, what they're learning about. There are also a lot of videos on YouTube, frankly, to search about neural networks and various like resources. I can try to look for some afterwards as well, and then I can send it to you if you'd like.
Yeah, that would be perfect. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Yeah, and then Michael, so we learned a little bit about your kind of academic background. So for the people who don't know, can you tell us a little bit about some of the extracurriculars you did while you were at UCC?
Mm-hmm. So I was involved in a couple of different things, like debate, the musical, Convergence, the school newspaper, and the math club and Helping Hands. So I've been just trying to do things that, like, as you can tell from that list, like I just get really easily interested by a lot of different things. So like I was alluding to earlier about that, like overcommitting yourself kind of thing. That was definitely me in high school, like trying to get a ton of different things done. And I think it's rewarding at the same time, trying to push yourself and try to vary your own experiences. And I think that's when you can really get exposed to a lot of different diverse activities. And yeah.
That's great, Michael. So we know it's maybe a little bit early to ask this, but what do you see yourself doing in the future? Are you going to be a car engineer or are you going to be an entrepreneur? Maybe just give us a little bit immature answer. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, at this point, like I see myself probably just going into something like big tech, not necessarily specific, like it doesn't have to be in self-driving cars. Like it might be designing like the next product or something like that for Apple or like Microsoft, Google, things like that. I really like how a lot of their companies are structured. It seems like there's better work-life balance in a lot of other companies as well. And it's nice just being surrounded by like a community of so many innovators and just where you can discuss ideas and like visions for the next years to come.
Okay, speaking of years to come and your path forward, if you didn't take this kind of big tech engineering path, what's another field that it's always interested you?
The second field is actually like going into academia, but not full necessarily entirely because of research. I'm actually really interested in just like teaching people and explaining concepts to people. That's something I've always enjoyed. And I think teaching at the university level is very nice specifically because you get to meet like and really work with a lot of students that can help you on projects and also have a lot of cool ideas as well. I think to give you actually like a cool role model of mine, I would say like Professor Malin at Harvard. He's the guy who teaches CS50 online, if you've ever heard of his courses. And I think he just makes his classes really interactive and engaging. And it's so nice that he's able to reach such a large audience through his online course and teach computer science to students around the world who might not have access to that otherwise. I think that's really quite admirable and exciting for me in particular.
Yeah, I also have a question about your entire like application process. We
Mhm.
know that Harvard is extremely prestigious institution, extremely selective. So do you have any like, tips or advice for students that might want to pursue education somewhere in the US or in Canada? Any tips for applications?
For sure. I'd say to actually, this goes back to the time management idea, but I'd say to start early. A lot of the cases, especially for US schools, like the essays remain the same every year. I believe the Common App essays are not changing this year. I'm not sure, but they didn't change for the admission season that just passed. But the idea is a lot of it is already out there, so you can actually get a head start on some of the applications. Because I think especially you don't want to put this to the last minute and really rush at the end because you don't want to put like a piece of work that doesn't represent your best self, right? And well, this is also just a kind of a more funny end to it. Like a lot of people do end up trying to submit their application like on the last day, and the website usually crashes then. So you definitely want to avoid that, right?
Those are some good tips, boys. Don't submit your application last minute.
Yeah, don't do the 11:59 p.m. kind of thing,
Yeah.